asked the DBD community to give every single killer a score from 1 to 5 based on how fun they were to play as and to play against. With almost 10,000 forms submitted and almost 2 million votes scored, we finally have the results. Here's how it works. The community received 2 questions for every killer. 1, how fun are they to play as? And 2, how fun are they to play against? For both of these questions, they would choose a score from 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. Then I took these votes, did a little bit of math, and got a total number of points for how fun they are to play as and how fun they are to play against. These totals were combined into a grand total, which we'll be using to rank every single killer from worst to best based on overall community sentiment. This video took a ton of effort obtaining and organizing all this data, so if you drop a like, I'd really appreciate it. Anyway guys, let's get into the list. Completely unsurprisingly, the lowest killer on the list is the Skull Merchant. I'm pretty sure a majority of you thought she was going to be the lowest on the list. This killer has been in the ground since before she came out. Before she even came out, the community hated her because they didn't like her aesthetic and thought she was just like a normal human being and not a cool killer. But on top of that, she released as a 3-gen killer during a 3-gen killer perk meta. So it was just 2 things mixed together and it was so awful. It created these matches where she could essentially hold the game hostage. Of course, I have to mention that one game where the best team in the world played against a Skull Merchant and the game ended up lasting like 45 minutes. It was insane. And ever since then, Behavior has tried to rework her and buff her and nerf her. But I'm pretty sure it got to the point where they just realized that this killer was a mistake. So they just nerfed her into the ground so that nobody would play her. So now she's one of the weakest killers in the game, which is why most people don't like playing as her. And then playing against her, I don't even think people have played against the new Skull Merchant. I think these are all terrible votes, either for the memes or just because everybody hates Skull Merchant. So it's just a bandwagon to hate Skull Merchant. But when people did play Skull Merchant, she was really boring to play against. The next killer on this list is also not very surprising, and that is the Twins. The Twins got a pretty similar score to Skull Merchant, and I completely agree with these votes. From the survivor's perspective, she's very dull to play against because if you're ever alone with Victor, you basically have 0 counterplay because he is so fast. So the only way to properly play against this killer is to play in pairs. But of course, this isn't always possible depending on the situation and depending on if you're solo queuing or not. So the amount of coordination required to counter this killer just makes her not very fun to play against. And then playing as, she is known for being one of the buggiest killers in the game and one of the clunkiest killers in the game. For her entire lifespan, she's had game-breaking bugs, she's had extremely long, clunky cooldowns, and there's essentially 0 interactivity chasing survivors because the way you get damage is just releasing Victor and then running towards someone and then they have no counterplay, so you hit them or you down them. And most people don't find that very fun, so I can completely understand why this is the second lowest killer on this list. And the next killer, I am so glad you guys put this there. This is the Trickster. Now, the Trickster does have a much higher score playing as, and that makes sense to me because he is a little bit more interesting to play as than to play against, because there are a few fun things that you can do with like your trick blades or going for cool shots through windows and whatnot, but playing against him is so awful. First off, he's one of those killers where you essentially have no counterplay and chase unless you're in a tall loop, but on a lot of maps and in a lot of positions, you can't physically go to a tall loop either because it's a dead zone or because you have to complete gens that are not near that loop, and you can't exactly dodge his power because he could just continue spamming them and he has like 40 knives or something. So his main counterplay is positioning and holding W, and positions in this game become weaker over time, so you can't consistently and reliably use positioning as a counter. So that leaves the main counterplay to this killer to be holding W and just leaving whatever loop you're in. And you'll see this as a common theme in this list. People don't enjoy the counterplay of holding W from both the survivor and the killer side. If there's a killer that has an ability that essentially just forces you to leave the loop, nobody tends to like it because it's very uninteractive from both sides. From the survivor's perspective, you're not really doing any mind games, you're just kind of going from loop to loop until you die. And from the killer's perspective, you're also not doing any mind games, you're just spending the whole time trying to catch up to the survivor, especially on this killer who's slower than normal. So overall, I think this is another failure of a design, and I'm glad to see that most of the community agrees too. The next killer on this list, which I am a little sad about, but I completely understand why, is the Hag. The Hag got a very even vote for playing against and playing as, and I think it's because she is such a unique killer that not a lot of people play, so a lot of people don't actually know how to play as her or how to play against her very well. I personally think she's very fun to play against and to play as, but I know I'm in the minority here. I just find the tug of war counterplay to be very interactive on both sides, but I think most survivors don't like playing against her because they feel like she's just designed to camp. But in my opinion, it's very easy to counter this camping playstyle, and if the Hag is putting a bunch of traps near a hook, for example, but they're all in close proximity of each other, then they're not a good Hag player, so it should be easy to win the game anyway. To counter the Hag, hag, you should be finding her traps and triggering them constantly to keep up pressure around the map because it takes her so long to set those traps back up. And if you go on the edge of the trap's radius, you're able to trigger them without them even being hit, or you can just wipe them away if you don't want any risk. But I personally find it more fun to actually trigger the trap and pull her away from a chase and continue doing that throughout the match with my friends. But of course, I can see why she would be extremely annoying to play against as a solo queue player. And playing as she has a low score, I think because most people don't really enjoy trap killers. I think a lot of people probably find her rather slow paced because you have to spend all this time setting up your traps, and it's frustrating if you're not able to keep that web of traps consistently set up. So overall, I understand why she is this low on the list. The next killer is the Knight. The Knight has a lower score for playing against than playing as. He has a relatively even score on every single vote for playing as, which does actually make sense in my opinion because I have seen opinions all over the place for this killer. But the low votes for playing against does actually make sense because again, he's one of those killers where the only counterplay in most situations is to hold W, especially because he's able to choose which guard to put out. If you're in a chase, for example, and there's a pallet down, well, he can easily just use his card effects to break it instantly. So you pretty much have to leave the loop before that even happens. And if he wants to use his assassin to chase you, then pretty much the only counterplay is to leave the loop when he's placing the assassin. So it ends up being this non-interactive playstyle where you just have to keep holding W and just keep running. And again, most people find that pretty monotonous. The next killer on this list is the Clown. So this vote I feel like would be a little bit different now. In fact, it might even be a little bit lower because I did this poll before the recent Clown buffs where he can get a ton of haste. So keep that in mind. His new version might be a little bit lower because I know people absolutely hate playing against him now. So I'm going to talk about his pre-buff version, and his scores again make perfect sense. Pretty much nobody likes playing against the Clown because again, it's another hold W killer. So you either stay in the loop and then get hit with his purple gas and then don't really have enough time to make it to a loop, or you just have to pre-drop the pallets and then create a bunch of dead zones very early, or the best counterplay is to just leave the loop entirely and go to a different loop and continue to repeat this until he catches up. He is one of my personally least favorite killers to play against, and it seems that a majority of people share that opinion. But the score for playing as is relatively average, and the graph kind of looks like a bell curve, which does make sense to me. He is pretty fun to play as. It's super satisfying hitting survivors with your bottles, and it's really satisfying using your yellow bottles in tandem with your purple bottles to get a hit. You just feel like a god doing that, even though it's not like technically that hard. Plus, that little flick that he does with his knife every time you hit a survivor is so satisfying, and I can guarantee you that some of these votes are higher just because of that. So overall, it does make sense that he is this low, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was even a couple spots lower after his buff. The next killer on this list is the Houndmaster, which I'm honestly kind of surprised by. She has a relatively average score overall, with a majority of people voting that she's just decent to play as, but most people voting that she's either decent to play against or lower. I'm going to tell you a little secret. I have still yet to play against a Houndmaster because I was in college working on my thesis projects and stuff when Houndmaster was released, so I wasn't really playing DBD at the time, and it seems like she's a really unpopular killer because I have yet to play against her. So I honestly have no input on this. I have played as her though, and I would agree that she is just kind of mediocre to play as. I do think she's really satisfying and is pretty fun to play as in a lot of situations, but sometimes she's like really buggy and really kind of clunky. Like sometimes you try to send the dog to a gen and it just won't work for some reason, even if you're close to it. Like it's just really inconsistent, and I think that lowers the score for a lot of people. But playing against her, theoretically on paper, I would probably vote for a 3, even though I haven't actually played against her, because she does seem to have relative counterplay, because obviously she's very telegraphed with her whistle, and you see exactly where the dog goes, so you're able to dodge it. But she might be one of those killers where the dog is so fast that the ping can't keep up with it, so it just hits you around really stupid things. I don't know, if you guys have any more input on playing against this killer, please let me know in the comments because I have no clue. The next killer on this list is Freddy. Now I have a feeling that the old Freddy would have been significantly lower on this list because his playing as score probably would have been much lower, but now that he's reworked, he is a lot more interesting to play as because now you not only have the snares which go through walls and you don't just place them, you also have access to the pallets, so you can use both snares and pallets at the same time now. Plus you can use the rupture ability to explode these dream pallets on a survivor and instantly injure them if they're asleep. So there's a lot more interactivity that he can do in chase, which is also true from the survivor's standpoint, which is why he has a little bit more of an average score. Unfortunately, the interactivity playing against him isn't extremely exciting like some other killers on this list, so I think that's why the votes are mostly like 1 to 3 range, especially because his snares are so wide that sometimes you can't even dodge them at all. But overall, I think he's in a much more interesting spot nowadays, which is why he has a decent score. The next killer we have on this list is the Trapper, which I'm extremely surprised that he's this high. It seems like a ton of people actually don't mind playing against the Trapper, and the reason I think that is probably because he's so weak, so he has to actually chase you. And I do agree, the fact that he has to actually chase you makes this killer immediately more fun to play against because it's actually interactive. Plus, if you know how to counter this killer by constantly constantly getting rid of his traps and staying away from the basement, then you kind of have a free win, I'm not gonna lie. And then playing as this killer, I personally don't find him fun because I find him extremely slow paced, and because he's so weak, it feels like you're doing nothing the entire game, especially if you get a really survivor-sided map. But I cannot deny the satisfaction of getting a survivor in one of your traps. Oh my god, it is one of the best feelings in this game. So with that being said, I do understand why there are quite a few higher votes on this killer for playing as. There are a significant number of people that know that he is extremely weak, but still find that satisfaction of getting traps to be so fun that they still enjoy playing him. But I do understand why he's relatively low on the list, because if it's a good trapper and he keeps a trap on hand to trap a loop that he's looping you in, then you pretty much just have to leave and go to another loop, which again kind of turns into that whole W playstyle. Oh boy, the next killer on this list is probably the most divisive killer on this list, and that is the ghoul. And this is the most like kitchen fork found in kitchen thing I've ever seen in my life. Playing against the ghoul has a very, very poor score, whereas playing as the ghoul has a really high score. And this is like so obvious. Playing as this killer is so much fun because A, it's a slingshot killer slash grappling hook killer, and who doesn't love a grappling hook mechanic in video games? Like, grappling hook mechanics are one of the best mechanics in any video game ever. Plus, it is so easy to down survivors because they essentially have no counterplay. You're able to hit them and instantly catch up to them before they even make it to another resource. And there's so many times in Chase where you can legit just go around a wall so fast that they can't even react to it, and then you're able to zone them and down them easily. Like, this killer is so much fun, and he's really strong. So no wonder he has so many high votes. But then there's the opposite end of the spectrum where you're playing against this killer, and oh my god, it's awful. I'm sure most of you people that play against this killer agree that he is unbearable to play against. It's not even the fact that he can get a free injure, because that's not even that bad. Like, Legion can do that, Plague can do that, whatever. It's the fact that after this injure, you have very little ways of countering his ability. Try to run to a different loop, he'll catch up before he can get up to you. Stay in the same loop, well, he could just slingshot himself around the walls and body block you from reaching a pallet or a window. Pretty much the only decent counterplay to this killer is pre-dropping pallets, which by the way, he can jump over, or trying to do kind of the nurse counterplay where you run back towards him as he's using his ability. But of course, he can cancel his ability, so it turns into a 50-50. This killer is so strong and very, very difficult to counter, so I completely understand why most of you think he is terrible to play against. The next killer on this list is the Onryo, and this one makes perfect sense to me. She is very, very middle of the road. She's kind of mediocre to play against, and she's kind of mediocre to play as. Playing against does have more votes in the 1 to 2 range, because a lot of times it's really annoying to loop her because she has her passive phase ability, so sometimes you have no way of reacting. But on top of that, this is one of the best tunnelers in the game, because when she demanifests, she can literally phase through survivors. So if she's trying to target one specific survivor, you cannot body block them because she'll just go straight through you. So if the killer plays kind of like an asshole, which most of them do from my experience, it is quite frustrating to play against her. But if they play like a normal killer, then she's fine, she's whatever, because at least she actually has to chase you. And playing as her, I personally would agree with the high score being 3. I think she's fine. She's kind of interesting with the TVs and like trying to get condemned stacks and stuff, but that's kind of like her only ability. Like, she kind of has stealth, but she also has a lullaby in her stealth, so people still know that you're coming. They just don't exactly know how close you are. So overall, I don't really feel like she has that interesting of a power, and I think that's probably why most people think she's just average. The next killer on this list is the nurse. Now, obviously, the score for playing against her is extremely low because in a lot of situations, you have very little counterplay, and she's the strongest killer in the game. Although surprisingly, she does have a lot of votes for 2 and 3, and she has a lot more 4 votes than I would have expected. And my theory for this is the votes that are higher tend to be from people who are either really low MMR or really high MMR. It's kind of like that one bell curve meme where like, it's really fun to play against nurse when you're new to the game because the people who play nurse are really bad at nurse. And if you're bad at nurse, it's just like a free game. But then as you get into the middle section where the nurses become a little bit more competent, but you don't really know how to counter the nurse, then she seems like absolutely overpowered and there's nothing you can do. But then as you get to higher MMRs, you start to learn a lot of like really tiny, small tips and tricks on how to counter the nurse. So she's a lot more interesting to play against, such as knowing the exact hitboxes that make it hard for nurse to teleport around, like certain walls or using the hill or using certain buildings on the maps, and knowing exactly how to break line of sight to confuse her. So I think that's probably my theory on why she has some higher votes for playing against. But who knows? Maybe people just enjoy the counterplay to her. And for playing as, this is kind of interesting. I thought it would be a little bit higher because I personally think she's one of the most fun killers in the game. Not even because she's strong, just because it's really fun to do like prediction shots or long shots through a bunch of walls. But she seems to have a relatively even spread. What I would have expected is like a reverse bell curve where she has a lot of 1 votes and she has a lot of 5 votes, but then 2, 3, and 4 are a little bit lower because usually most people hate playing as her because they suck at her, or they really like playing her because they're good at her. And then there's not really in between. But I guess this proves that wrong. So overall, it seems like one of those killers killers where every single person has a completely different opinion on her, which is super interesting, honestly. The next killer on this list, which makes me also kind of sad, is the Legion. There is literally a linear curve downward of enjoyment of this killer, which is so interesting to me because I think the Legion is one of the most fun killers to play against purely for the fact that they have to chase you. Like, they're forced to chase you if they want to down you. And chasing is the most fun thing in this game. So I don't really understand why people don't like playing against this killer. What I'm going to assume is most people don't actually know the counterplay of this killer, which is to just never heal. If you keep healing against this killer, you're going to have to mend constantly because the killer's just going to continuously get free injures. So to properly play against this killer, you just don't heal. So then you're not wasting pointless time. And then the killer is forced to actually chase you. So if you're competent in chase, then the killer essentially has no ability. So that's why I'm surprised that it has such low votes, because if you just don't heal and you don't group up, this killer has no ability. Playing as is pretty evenly spread as well, although there's more votes on the 3 to 5 range. And I think this makes sense. This is a relatively simple killer, so it appeals to a wider audience. It has a very low skill floor and a very low skill ceiling. So I think it's a killer that people can quickly become comfortable with. Plus you have to actually chase survivors, so there is that interactivity as well. I would personally give them a 3 myself because I do like having actual chases, but their power isn't exactly the most exciting thing in the world. So overall, I think the most shocking thing is most people just don't enjoy playing against them. The next killer on this list is the Plague. I kind of figured that the Plague was going to be the most like average voted killer on this list, but I guess not. It seems like a lot of survivors don't enjoy playing against the Plague, and I think what my theory is that most players in this game, especially for my audience because I'm an educational channel mostly, tend to have less experience on the game and tend to have less than like 1,000 hours. Actually, I know that for a fact because I had them answer that in this poll. And most people with less experience aren't as comfortable being injured the entire game because they feel so vulnerable, which is completely fair. I felt the exact same way when I was in that position. But again, this is another one of those killers just like Legion, where as long as you just stay injured, the killer has no power and has to chase you. Unless of course they have Apple add-ons to have more corrupt purges, but a majority of people voted 3, and I would probably agree with that. Again, she's fun because she has to actually chase you, but besides that, she doesn't have an interesting power, and especially if you're playing solo queue where other survivors will cleanse, then she gets a very, very strong ability with very little counterplay. So if you're playing with people that don't know how to counter her, it does make sense that she would have a lower score. And then playing as, I can see why she's kind of in the 3 to 4 range. Again, her ability isn't the most exciting, especially if you're playing against a team that doesn't cleanse, because then you have no power. But if you're playing against a team that does cleanse, especially if they cleanse in good positions for you, then she can be very fun because you can get your corrupt purge and just go crazy. So I probably would have put her a little bit higher on my personal list, but most of the votes are about a 3, which is exactly what I would agree with. The next killer on this list is the Pig. Now again, all of these votes are before her recent buffs, but most of her recent buffs are just quality of life things. And as you can see by the graphs, she is the most like average enjoyed killer in the game. These are almost perfect bell curves. And I'd probably agree with this. From a survivor's perspective, she is pretty fun because she has to actually chase you, but a lot of good pigs will play in a way where they basically force the survivors to come to them or to have different objectives. So for example, if they're able to get like 2 active head traps on survivors, then they can easily slug someone because that means that no gens are being done at all because the other survivor without a head trap has to go pick up the slug survivor and the 2 with the head traps have to be getting their head traps off. So really, really good pigs will make playing against them pretty miserable, but most of the time playing against Pig is pretty fun. And then playing as, I would say the same thing. I think she's very average. She's a little bit slow paced and there was pretty much never any point in using her stealth because you were so slow. So it's just kind of a waste of time. Plus her ambush attack wasn't very good either. But now that she's been buffed and her stealth attack is much quicker, her terror radius dissipates much faster, and her ambush is a little bit better, she's probably a lot more interesting to play as now. But I have yet to play her since the buff, so any Pig players, let me know in the comments below. Next up on the list, we have the Artist, which is a very, very similar bell curve on her graphs. And I would completely agree with this. I would also say that she is decent to play as and decent to play against. Playing against her is relatively fun in most situations, but sometimes, especially if they're good, they can put you into situations where you get hit no matter what you do. Although for Artist, I do feel like this is a lot more difficult to pull off than some other killers like Trickster. So it's less of that just hold W counterplay, even though that is technically the best thing to do against this killer. And playing as is also pretty decently fun because it is satisfying to get shots through walls and to go for long shots and stuff. But sometimes you can get maps that have a ton of elevation, so your birds basically do nothing. So she can be frustrating in some situations, but overall, she is relatively decent to play as. So I completely agree with this placement. Next up, we have the Doctor. It seems like most survivors lean towards the lower scores of this killer, with the highest score being a 3, and I would probably agree with this as well. I think he's overall fine to play against, but he's one of those killers that can guarantee a hit. It just takes a really long time. So if you're ever in like a pallet loop, for example, he'll just continuously shock you to prevent you from throwing the pallet and catch up slowly by slowly until he eventually hits you. So it's not the most interesting thing in the world, but playing as him is more in the 3 to 4 range, which does make sense. It is really satisfying to time your shock perfectly to prevent a survivor from vaulting a window or throwing a pallet or something. something, and it's pretty nice that he can get information frequently, so you'll never really have to deal with stealth players, and you always kind of know where to go next. So overall, I would agree with this. The next killer, which I'm very sad about, is Pinhead. I personally find Pinhead to be very fun to play against because he has an extremely telegraphed ability that has a ton of counterplay, so I actually really enjoy chases with him. But then again, he has the ability of the box, and a large majority of people play solo queue, and playing solo queue against this killer is relatively miserable because you never know if someone is going for the box. So if you assume someone is going for the box, but then they're not, then you're just going to be in chain hunt for a long time. But if you assume no one is going for the box, but somebody is, then 2 or more of you are going for the box, which means less people on gens. So I do think that is a relatively poor design decision, and I kind of wish they had something on the HUD where if you were like within a certain distance of the box and you were looking at it, then it would show on the HUD that you're going for the box. I think that would help this killer be a little bit less annoying. And then for his playing as score, it's mostly 3 and 4, which I would agree with. I don't personally think he's super exciting to play as. I don't think he's extremely fun to play as, but he is still relatively fun, and I do enjoy playing him every once in a while. The next killer on this list is the Singularity, and this one actually surprised me quite a bit. I figured that most of these scores would lean a little bit lower. For playing against, it might just be my MMR because every Singularity I play against is extremely good at Singularity. So they are so hard to play against, even in like 4-man survive with friends, because they're just so competent and they have like 6,000 hours or above. So I don't have much experience playing against Singularities that are just kind of average. So I'd personally probably give them a 2 because good Singularities make you feel like you have no counterplay. Even though I know there is counterplay for this killer, they just make you feel like there's none. And then for playing as, I'm actually very surprised that it's this high. I do think that the Singularity is pretty fun to play as, but he is so difficult to get value out of unless the survivors aren't very competent, which I guess would be most survivors. So maybe that's why he has such a high score. You know what? That's probably why. But if you play against competent survivors that know how to use EMPs properly, you essentially have no ability for the majority of the match. So I'm kind of shocked that it's this high. But if they don't use EMPs very well, then yes, I do agree that this killer is pretty fun. He does use a lot of brain power to play properly, which is exactly the reason why I enjoy playing him, because it's a ton of micromanagement and kind of map knowledge and just knowing where you have cameras and where you need to be looking. So he is very complex and is one of the highest skill ceiling killers in the game. So you do have a lot to learn, which is pretty fun. The next killer on the list is Chucky. I despise playing against this killer personally. I hate playing against this killer because he's short. When you're short, you're harder to see, which makes you harder to track. And he wouldn't be that bad in old Dead by Daylight, but modern DBD has so many maps that have really bad palettes that are just high enough to block Chucky. Like obviously you could still see his footsteps in these situations, but his footsteps aren't giving you a read on him every single frame like you do with every other killer. So he can easily fake in one direction and then go the other direction, and you have very little time to react. That is my personal least favorite part about this killer, is just the fact that he's short. I don't actually mind his ability that much because it has been nerfed. Like it used to be really annoying to play against, but now it's not that much. It's just another killer with a dash ability because we don't have enough of those. But overall, he's not that bad. I just like to complain about him. Oh, I also forgot to mention that I hate the fact that he can stealth because he's short and he can stealth, which basically makes him invisible if he plays it right, while being able to hit you while stealthing. So that is pretty annoying sometimes. And then playing against him, I do agree he is on the higher side. I don't personally think he's a 5, but I do think he is probably a 3 or a 4. Not only are you able to stealth, so it prevents survivors from pre-leaving gens, so you're not just holding W for a majority of the match, you're also able to use your slice and dice to do some really fun hits, especially if you have good map knowledge. Plus, it's a pretty interactive ability with the survivors as well, so it's fun to do certain mind games and predict where they're going to be. So I would agree with the votes for playing as. Next up, we have the Spirit. I'm kind of surprised that so many people don't mind playing against the Spirit. I personally think she's abysmal to play against because if the Spirit is good, every single chase will just be a 50-50 unless you have Iron Will. And in my opinion, 50-50s against the Spirit aren't as fun because she's faster than you. I don't mind 50-50s in most situations, but in her ability, she's way faster than you, so the 50-50 actually kind of leans in her favor, especially because she can bait one way and then go the other way. So I don't really enjoy her counterplay that much, especially because good spirits are only going to phase when you're injured, which means you won't be able to just walk to counter her and chase because she could just hear you. So everything just becomes a 50-50. Playing as her, a lot of people do lean towards the higher end. I know I'm in the minority. I just don't really like playing as her. I find her to be relatively slow paced, and conceptually, I think she's awesome. Like the power conceptually is really cool, but again, I don't enjoy 50-50s as much as actual mind games. Like yes, there are certain mind games that you can do against the Spirit and as the Spirit, but a majority of your hits will just be from 50-50s, so I don't personally find that very fun. But I think most people probably find her relatively fun because she has a very low skill floor and is super easy to use, and it is also very strong, so it makes sense that most people would lean towards the higher side. Next up on the list, we have the Xenomorph. This is another one of those averagely voted killers that leans a little bit on the higher end. I'm actually kind of shocked by this because personally, this is one of my least favorite favorite killers to play against because I do not think that its tail attack is a good design. I think any killer with a ranged attack, especially ones that can hit over pallets and over walls, should be very well telegraphed. So Huntress and Pinhead and the Unknown are all good examples of this because you can easily tell that they're about to use their ability. For the Xenomorph, however, you get no reaction time to their tail attack, so they can put you into a situation where no matter what you do, you get hit. And I hate those situations. One of my least favorite things in PvP games is when the outcome of the situation is completely out of your control and there's nothing you can really do about it. And this killer unfortunately puts you into those positions a ton. The most basic example of this is if you're on a pallet. If you throw the pallet, they're just going to use their tail attack and hit you. But if you don't throw the pallet, they're just going to walk through it and hit you. So no matter what you do, you get hit in that situation. So the only counterplay against this killer turns into just using the flame turrets. And I don't think that's interesting at all. Maybe if you didn't walk at a snail's pace, then the counterplay would be a little bit more interesting. But the fact that you have to go to some place, pick up a turret, walk to actually put it in a good position, and then the killer could potentially just avoid it in general, just makes me personally not enjoy playing against them that much, especially because you only have a limited amount of flame turrets. In my opinion, a good design for a killer is when they have a telegraphed interactive ability in chase, because then it's fun from both the killer's perspective and the survivor's perspective. However, most people don't mind playing against this killer, and it seems like most people do relatively enjoy playing as this killer as well. The next killer on this list is the Dread. This killer also has relatively average votes, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I personally do not agree with the playing as scores. I would put him in a 1 or a 2 because I find him to be very slow, very weak, and very boring to play as, but it seems like most people think he's decent, if not better than decent to play as, which is kind of what I expected, to be honest. And playing against him seems to be mediocre, if not a little bit higher, which I do actually agree with. I think he is pretty fun to play against, and there are some mind games you can do with the Remnant to make it not just like 50-50s all the time, but I don't really think his power is the most interesting thing in the world, which is why he has a very average score. The next killer on the list is the Wraith, and my god, I have conflicting opinions on the Wraith. The total community score for playing against is pretty much the standard bell curve, which I would probably agree with. It's so weird because if you're playing against a good Wraith, he is one of the most boring killers in the game. I swear, like, he can be completely miserable to play against, but most Wraiths are not actually that good, which means he's actually kind of fun to play against. So that's why I'd probably put him in a 3. But whenever you have good Wraiths that just constantly do hit and run play style with Sloppy Butcher and Gift of Pain and all that stuff, it is rough. It is really rough. And playing as him, I would actually agree with this. Most people put him in the 3 to 4 range, and I think this is a perfect placement for him. He is a relatively standard killer with an easy to use ability that's actually quite fun. He's fast paced, he has decent mobility around the map, you have some looping potential in chase without it being overbearing, and you have to actually mind game the survivors, which is pretty fun. So I would completely agree with this placement. The next killer on this list is the Dark Lord, which a lot of people voted very high, which I'm kind of shocked by. This is another killer that came out during my final year of college, so I didn't really play when he was released, so I don't have too much experience playing as or against him, but from the few games I have, I would say he is pretty average to play against. There's definitely some interactive counterplay that is telegraphed pretty well, and it is kind of interesting how you have to completely change your playstyle depending on the form that he's in, so that makes chases a little bit more interactive. And playing as him, a lot of people seem to really enjoy playing as him. I've played a few games and he's like fine in my opinion. To me, he feels very slow and clunky, but I don't mind playing as him because it's kind of interesting choosing which abilities you want to use in different situations. So I can see why most of you voted him pretty high. All right, moving on to the next killer, we have Bubba. Bubba's ranking makes complete sense to me. People seem to enjoy playing against him quite a bit, as you can tell by the graph, and this makes sense. This is a killer that does have to chase, but there's a ton of mind games that you can do in chase for both the survivor and the killer's perspective. Plus, survivors have plenty of ways to counter this killer, especially if you're on certain maps like Larry's or something, which has a ton of windows. And the only reason I think there are votes kind of lower on the spectrum is because so many cannibals can just camp really easily. And obviously this is not fun if you're the survivor, because if a Bubba's camping, there's basically nothing that you can do to save that person. And he can tunnel pretty well because he can hit the endurance off the hook and still catch up to hit them again while in his saw. So overall, even though Bubba is a very fun killer to play against in general, if the killer decides to play kind of scummy, then it can be not very fun to go against. And playing as, this makes sense. It is a little bit on the higher end, but there's mostly 3s. Overall, I think this is because he's pretty straightforward and pretty simple, so he's easy to use. But again, like I was saying earlier, there are certain maps that make this killer miserable to play as, such as Larry's with all the windows, or Gideon Meat Plant with all the pallets, especially Gideon. Oh my god, that map is so boring as this killer, because you chase a survivor, you pull up your saw, they throw the pallet, you break the pallet, and you just do this like 20 times, and it's so boring. But overall, decent placement. I would pretty much agree with this. The next killer on our list is Michael Myers, and Myers has a pretty good rating overall for playing against, and I would have to agree with this. Again, this is a killer that has to do an M1 chase, But there are a ton of mind games that you could do in Chase even when he's in tier 3 because they're pretty predictable. Like a ton of them tend to use Bamboozle or Superior Anatomy, which make your vault speed faster, to stack with the tier 3 vaulting speed. So you could use this to your advantage to do some really fun and interesting mind games to get some good distance on him. Plus, this killer has a ton of different add-ons that completely change up his playstyle. Take Scratch Mirror, for example. I know a lot of survivors think Scratch Mirror Myers is pretty fun, although I feel like that playstyle is kind of dead now that map offerings don't really do anything. But it is fun to try to avoid his stock for as long as possible, and when you know how to counter his tier 3 chases, you can avoid it pretty well. The next killer on this list is Vecna. I think we've officially crossed the threshold of killers that most people enjoy, and of course Vecna is one of them. He does have a higher playing as score than playing against score, which does make sense. I think Vecna is one of the most fun killers in the game. I think just the fact that you have to micromanage all 4 different abilities, so you're constantly doing something during the match, is really fun, and his fly ability is nice because you just get to catch up to survivors and don't have to just hold W to catch up to them. So although his abilities aren't technically that strong, you're still always doing something and always thinking about something and always trying to use an ability, and I think a lot of people enjoy that micromanagement. And playing against him, it seems like a lot of people also enjoy it, and I think part of the reason for this is because he actually has relative counterplay. Like pretty much the only thing that you can't counter is if he's close to you and he uses his range attack, because as soon as they spawn, they can hit you. But besides that, you just have to crouch to avoid this ability, which yes, he could technically use to slow you down so you don't make it to a resource, but you can position yourself properly to be a bit more safe. Plus, I think a lot of people enjoy playing against this killer because of his chests. Being able to get a bunch of cool, unique items that are exclusive to this killer and essentially have gambling in DBD with the form of the D20 that could potentially give you a really, really cool item is a very exciting mechanic. So I think overall, this is a killer that is relatively fast-paced and has some pretty interactive chases that make him a little bit more interesting to play as and play against. Moving on to the next killer, we have the Deathslinger. The Deathslinger has a relatively average score for playing against. A majority of the votes are on 3 and 4, and I think this makes sense. His power is so simple and straightforward that you only really have to worry about one thing, and that's dodging his shots. And it's really fun, especially if you play Deathslinger, it's really fun to know kind of when they tend to shoot. So as a survivor, you can apply that to your own gameplay to counter him. And for me personally, because I love playing Deathslinger, whenever I play against him as survivor, it's really fun because I know exactly the moments when they like to shoot. So I can swing certain walls wide or make it look like I'm going to vault a window and then crouch. So there's just a ton of cool mind games that you can do against this killer, and I think that's why most people enjoy him. Plus, he's a 4.4 meters per second killer, which means he's slower than average. So if you're in a loop where he cannot shoot you, then he's much easier to loop in general. And playing as him has a very similar score, but a little bit more votes on the 5s. And I can totally see why. This killer is extremely satisfying to play, especially if you go for cool shots through cracks or cool shots through walls or even just long shots. Being able to hit those and get a hit out of it is so much fun. Plus, he's not like that difficult to use once you kind of get used to the travel time of a spear and the ADS speed. But if you have any FPS background, he's really not that difficult to use. I love this killer. I think he's a very, very fun killer to play, and I'm glad to see that most of the community agrees. I cannot imagine playing this killer on console, so I have a feeling a lot of the lower votes are console players. The next killer we have on the list is the Executioner. Pyramid Head's playing against score is pretty much the same as Deathslinger's, which is kind of funny, and I think it makes perfect sense. I think that playing against score is very, very dependent on the killer's playstyle, because Pyramid Heads can M2 fake, where they just drag their sword up into the ground until they catch up to you at a pallet, and then if you throw the pallet, you get hit, but if you don't throw the pallet, then they cancel it and you get hit because they just body block you from the pallet. And these Pyramid Heads are very, very not fun to play against. But if you play against a Pyramid Head that actually uses their M2 ability and goes for cool shots, it is so much fun because there's so many mind games that you can do in Chase, especially if you lose line of sight. So that's why I generally think that the score is about average to a little bit higher than average, because most of the time this killer is fun to play against, but there are occasions where this killer is absolutely boring to play against, so it kind of evens out in the middle. And something I'm curious to see is if these scores would change now that he has new add-ons, because a lot of his new add-ons are extremely good, and I wonder if that would change people's perception of them. And then for playing as, again, very similar to the Deathslinger, hence why they're right next to each other. And again, this makes perfect sense. Just like Deathslinger, it's really satisfying to hit shots, especially when you can't even see the survivor and you hit them through the wall, or if you hit really far shots. Plus the fact that you can hit 2 people, even 3 people sometimes, with one M2 attack is super, super satisfying. So this killer has a ton of fun moments, and if you're sick of second chance perks like DS, you could just basically completely avoid it. So overall, I think this is a phenomenal rating for this killer. And the next killer we have on the list is Blight. I'm actually pretty surprised how high the scores are for Blight as playing against. I agree that Blight is pretty fun to play against. I think he's the only S tier killer that has well-designed counterplay, so it makes sense that a lot of people enjoy playing against him, and I'm glad to see that even though he is one of the best killers in the game. That kind of counters the argument of people thinking that survivors only like killers that are weak to play against just because they're easy to play against. But Blight is not super easy to play against in a lot of situations, and people still really enjoy playing against him. I think what people might like about it is the fact that he is just so fast paced, and you have to actually use your environment to counter him. You're not just constantly using windows and pallets and stuff. You're actually able to use the entire map. So it's a lot more of an interesting dynamic in chase. But unfortunately, if you're in a complete dead zone, you're just screwed with this killer. Like, there's really not much you can do. And playing as him, this is completely expected. Most of the votes are on 5. He is one of the most fun killers in the game because he's just so fast paced. And I completely agree with this. I have always loved the Blight, even since the PTB when he wasn't as strong and he was really short. He was just so fast that you're always doing something and always catching up to survivors. So there's never really downtime during the match. The only thing I would say that's really frustrating about Blight is just the jank hitboxes. It is so annoying to slide off of objects or hit things that are below your field of view or hit like tiny little molecules in the air that aren't even there. The hitboxes can be really bad sometimes, and that can be really frustrating, especially if it was like something that you were about to get a hit on. But overall, just from the gameplay alone, he is super fun. Moving on to the next killer, we have the Nemesis, and his playing against score is a little above average, and I would agree with this. I do think he's pretty fun for the most part. I just don't really like the fact that he can put you into situations where you get hit no matter what you do, because his tentacle attack is so quick, and because there's RNG of zombies, so sometimes you could be forced into situations where you either get hit by the zombie or you get hit by him. But besides those two situations, he is pretty fun in chase. It is actually pretty fun to dodge his tentacle attack in a normal chase situation, because you can do various baits and mind games to make him swing and miss, which gives you a ton of distance. And I do actually think that his zombies can create some interesting scenarios, especially if you're not contaminated already, where if you're in chase, you can get hit by the zombie so you don't get injured, but you still get the speed boost and make a ton of distance on the killer. And this can be super useful, especially if you're trying to pull the killer away from a certain area, or if you're just trying to extend the chase. So there are quite a few unique mechanics that are exclusive to this killer that are pretty fun to use. So that makes him a little bit more fun to play against. And then playing as, it's a very similar score, and I would pretty much agree with this. I would probably give him a 3 personally, but I think he has a bit of a higher score because he is pretty easy to use. Like, his skill floor is super low, so he appeals to a lot more people, and he has a built-in anti-loop power as well as slowdown with the contamination, as well as free information with his zombies. So he's kind of a well-rounded and good jack of all trades killer. Moving on to the next killer, we have the Demogorgon. I am very happy to see that most people enjoy playing against Demo. There are situations where you are pretty much guaranteed to get hit, and those situations are frustrating. But against Demo himself, these situations are pretty avoidable if you just know how to play against Demo. So for example, never loop Shack against this killer. You're just guaranteed to get hit. Like, there's basically no point in using Shack. And for other places that have long walls, then you just have to expect what the Demogorgon is going to do. Like, is he going to shred close to the wall, or is he going to think that you're going to dodge and shred further from the wall, hoping to hit you when you dodge? So there's a bunch of cool mind games that you can do against this killer, which is very interactive and very fun, and it emphasizes having a fun chase rather than having to counter him with some like macro gameplay. Plus, if you know how to counter the shreds on this killer by timing the pallet stuns perfectly so that you stun him rather than having him break it, you feel like a god, and it's really satisfying. But overall, I think a lot of people like playing against him because he has a really simple power to understand, and his power is completely chase oriented. And for playing as, it's a very similar score. I personally think he's one of my favorite killers in the game just because he's so fast paced. Like, you can get crazy shreds around walls if you kind of know the map layout and know where survivors like to go. And if you actually use your portals, which for some reason a lot of Demogorgons don't really use their portals that much, but you can constantly keep pressure up and get a ton of information with your portals, which makes for some really fast paced gameplay. So I love this killer, and seeing him this high on the list makes me very happy. Speaking of killers I love, the next killer on this list is Oni. I absolutely love Oni. I think he is one of the most well-designed killers in this game by far, so I'm really glad to see him in basically the top 10, I think. Most people voted this killer a 4, and I would probably completely agree with this. I think in general, he is really fun to play against because, again, he has one of those powers where it's completely chase-oriented. So the entire counterplay is just chase mind games, and that's what people like about this game. But this killer's ability is still really strong, so if you're able to loop him in his ability for a long time, it's super fun. I think a lot of people might have given it 3s because either they don't really know how to counter him, so they get flicked around corners a lot, or they don't like the fact that his power kind of supports slugging. But if he's in his power, you just shouldn't be grouping up in general, so I don't know how much validity that argument holds. But man, I love this killer, and I'm glad that most people do as well. And the next killer on this list, one of the most successful killers that they've released recently, this is the Unknown. The Unknown's scores are so high, and I'm very glad to see it. I think this is the perfect example of a well-designed killer. For playing against him, this killer has a very obvious telegraphed ability with his UVX launcher that has some super fun counterplay unless he's obviously close to you, and he has so many fun and interesting add-ons and perk builds that you can use to synergize with him that creates super dynamic scenarios. There's this really fun build that you can do on him with Trail of Torment, which is a perk that makes you undetectable whenever you kick a gen, but every survivor can see the gen that you kicked because it's highlighted in yellow, so they know that you have it. But if you place one of your hallucinations down near the gen that you kick, then you can stand next to the gen and pretend to be another hallucination. So when they come back to the gen to get rid of your Trail of Torment, you get a free hit off of it. So there's a ton of interesting builds that you can do with him, especially because his teleport is instant, so he can get around the map super quickly. So overall, fantastically designed killer. People seem to enjoy ranged killers that are very telegraphed and that have pretty detrimental downsides if you miss, and I think they are completely valid for that. Speaking of ranged killers, the next killer on the list is Springtrap himself. Another super successful killer, and honestly, I have to really applaud Behavior for this because they had so much pressure to make a good, fun killer for both sides, because this is the biggest license that they've ever gotten. Because not only did they have to make a killer that was fun to play as and play against, they also had to make a killer that was a low enough skill floor so that all the new people that were coming to play this game were able to use him very easily, but also had a high enough skill ceiling that all of the veterans of the game had something interesting to learn. And they absolutely nailed it. They literally hit all 4 of those criteria. So purely from a design standpoint, this killer was an absolute success. What is interesting though is that the playing against score is a lot lower than the playing as score, and I do think that this makes sense. I think there are some issues with his kit from a survivor standpoint that makes him a little bit frustrating to go against sometimes, and part of that would be the fact that he can camp doors to camp hooks or tunnel really easily. So that can obviously be pretty frustrating as survivor, especially if he's trying to tunnel someone, because he can easily return to the hook pretty much whenever he wants because there's no cooldown on his doors. And if you're in a dead zone or something, you're just getting hit no matter what you do. But besides those situations, I think this killer is really fun to play against. His counterplay is essentially like Huntress, but a lot easier to dodge. So you have the fun and interesting gameplay of Huntress, while also kind of mixed with a basic M1 chase, because if he misses, then he has to actually chase you normally. So you get the best of both worlds, which makes the chases a lot more interactive. And for playing as, I'm honestly surprised that the score is this high, but I do think he is a really fun killer. Again, his skill floor is pretty low, so he's relatively easy to use, even though he has a lot of mechanics that are a bit more difficult. But there are so many cool things that you can do with his ability, like get hits over walls. If you're able to learn the trajectory of his axe by throwing it up in the air, getting hits over walls is one of the most satisfying things I think in this game. Plus, if you're able to hit someone in a dead zone with your axe and then catch up to them and jump scare them before they make it to a resource, that is also extremely satisfying. So there's just a bunch of really fun things that you could do with this killer, and there's so many builds that he synergizes with because of his teleporting ability. The fact that he has stealth kind of built into his teleport as well as mobility means that you can do a ton of fun things to catch survivors off guard. So overall, this is a fantastic design of a killer. All right, guys, we're at the top 4 spots. If you've been enjoying this video, feel free to drop a like and subscribe down below. We are getting so close to 400,000 subscribers, so if we could reach that goal, that would be incredible. Plus, if we could hit 12,000 likes on this video, that would be amazing because I spent so much time on this. The next spot on our list is going to Ghostface. And honestly, this one's kind of shocking. I thought Ghostface was going to be more in the middle. I did not think he was going to be top 4. But look at his charts, like they're mostly 4s and 5s, which is kind of shocking. I did think that his playing against score was going to be a bit higher because he is pretty fun to play against. You have to really pay attention because he is obviously the stealthiest killer in the game. So you always have to be aware of your surroundings, which can make for some actually tense and scary situations. Not like scary, but kind of more jump scary situations. But then when he actually finds you, he does have to actually chase you. And again, people like to be chased. So it makes sense that his score is pretty high. And for being such a basic killer, he does actually have a ton of interesting counterplay, like knowing that he has stock on you, so you try to take a hit to get rid of your stock, or just trying to take hits for other survivors that are marked so that they don't go down in one hit. So there's a lot of interesting team play and coordination that you can do with this killer as well. So he's pretty fun to play against as both a solo queue player and as a team player. And playing as, I'm actually very surprised that this is this high. I kind of expected him to be more in the 3 range because he is so weak and he doesn't exactly have any interactivity in chase, but being able to have a stealthy playstyle is really fun as the killer. And I think this is the one stealth killer in the game where stealth is actually the main forefront of his ability. Because obviously you have stuff like Wraith and some other stealth killers like Pig, but those killers can't hit you in their stealth ability. So the survivors have a little bit of reaction time before they get hit. Whereas Ghostface, if you play it right, you can completely flank the survivor and sneak up to them and get a grab, or even just scare them with a hit, or even stalk them and then insta-down them without them even knowing. So I think that's probably why people like playing this killer, because he's the only killer where stealth is like the main gameplay loop. Moving on to the next killer, we have the Hillbilly. I am so glad to see him this high, even though people consider him S tier now. Hillbilly is a very, very fun killer to play against. And I think the reason for that is because he is the most interactive chase killer in the game. If he's using his chainsaw in chase, he has to go for some insane curves. And playing against Billies, especially good Billies, billies is almost more fun than playing against bad billies because they actually go for cool shots with their chainsaw, which is really fun in chase. If you know exactly how much the hillbilly can curve, then you could do a ton of different mind games to bait him in one direction or to completely dodge his ability. And I think that's why the chase is so interactive. Every single movement that both you and the killer do is very intentional from a mind game perspective. So it's not just straight anti-loop where he's just going to catch up to you. The entire gameplay loop is just chase. But it's risky chase because if he hits you with one of these cool mind games, then you're insta-downed. So it's super fun counterplay, and I think that is why he is the highest voted killer to play against. That's right, he is the highest scored killer from the survivor's perspective. And I completely agree with this. And then for playing as, he also has a very high vote, which is so nice to see because he used to be one of the least played killers in the game, and this chart would look completely opposite before his buff. But now that he has his overdrive mechanic, you are actually incentivized to use his power. So he turned from a super clunky and slow-paced killer into a super smooth and fast-paced killer in one update. And again, you have the interactive chase from the killer's perspective too. So you're constantly trying to mind game the survivors in chase as well. Plus, this is one of the highest skill ceiling killers in the game, so you have a ton to learn. And if you're able to hit cool shots where you do really cool curves, it is unbelievably satisfying. Plus, you can hit cool snipes by revving your chainsaw around the entire map and then hitting someone. So these moments just make him extremely fun to play as. And the second place spot on this list is the Huntress. She has a little bit of a lower score from the survivor's perspective, and I think that's purely because of the ping hits that she can get with her hatchets. And I don't personally think that's a very fair assessment. I don't really think that the fact that ping can cause her to get crazy hits is an issue with the design of the killer itself. That's mostly just a server issue, but I do understand the frustrations. I've been hit a countless times to hatchets that literally look like they go through walls, and yes, it is very annoying. But overall, she has a perfect design for a telegraphed ability. It's so obvious, even from a long distance when she's using her hatchet, because from a close distance, you can hear her charge her hatchet with her little grunt that she makes. And then from a long distance, obviously she's going to hold her hatchet so that she can get a faster throw speed, in which case you can hear the little shing sound that it makes. So regardless of what she does, you know exactly when she's going to use her power, which gives you ample time to come up with a mind game to counter her. Granted, if you're in a dead zone, then you're kind of screwed, which can be pretty unfortunate on certain maps that have a ton of dead zones. But overall, I still think this is a very well-designed killer that has a ton of interactivity and counterplay on both sides. And then for playing as, she is the highest rated killer in the game, which is so awesome to see. I definitely think she's a top 3 killer in my opinion, because not only does she have a really low skill floor, so she's super simple and straightforward, which is appealing to a lot of players, even if they're not very good at the game. She also has probably the highest skill ceiling in the entire game. So every time you play this killer, you will constantly improve at her, and you can go for crazy shots. The fact that her hatchet can go across the entire map and has unlimited range makes this killer unbelievably fun to use, because once you get good at her, you can go for long shots and cross maps and do some crazy shots. And I think that's why most people like this killer. She's easy to use when you get started, but you can also continue to get better at her to go for some insanely satisfying hits. Overall, goated opinions from the community. Glad to see her all the way up here. And then of course, the last killer on this list is Albert Wesker. Wesker wasn't voted the highest for playing against or playing as, but his scores average out to be just higher than the Hillbilly and the Huntress for the total. And I think this makes perfect sense. There's a reason that this killer is so popular. Like, look at his playing as score. They're pretty much mostly just 5s. There are barely any votes for the 1 and 2 range. There are a few votes for the 3 range, but mostly it's just 5 and 4. And this makes total sense. He's a really fun killer with an interesting ability that we haven't seen before, and you literally get to throw survivors or slam them against the wall. Like, that's awesome. Plus, he has an insanely high skill ceiling, especially when you're in actual loops, because most people generally don't use his power in loops, but once you get good at him, you're able to know exactly where and when to use your power to get hits while you're chasing survivors in these loops. And you feel like a really good Wesker player when you're able to get this down. Plus, he has a little bit of mobility with his power, so you are able to catch up to survivors pretty quickly, and he has a tiny bit of built-in slowdown since he gets people infected, which can come in handy. And then his playing against score is really high as well, which I'm a little bit surprised by. I was kind of expecting to see more 4s than 5s, because in my opinion, there are some situations with this killer that I think need to be tweaked. I think my main frustration of this killer is the fact that it's so difficult to tell if he's canceling his power or if he's going to try to use his second dash. So sometimes he could just zone you into a position where no matter what you do, you get hit. But generally, these situations are relatively rare unless the killer is super good. So besides those situations, this killer is super fun to play against. It's kind of like Deathslinger in a way where if you know when they like to use their power and where they're going to lunge, most likely, then you're able to dodge it pretty effectively. And the best part about playing against this killer is when you get them to accidentally vault a window. That is probably one of the funniest things in this game. It is so much fun baiting them into the window vault animation. So overall, another great design killer with a well-telegraphed ability and a fun interactive power in chase. And if you couldn't tell by all of the highest killers on this list, they all have to actually chase you. None of them are just anti-loop slowdown. And I think that says a lot, and I think behavior should take note of that. If you want to get better at killer, come check out this video where I show you 32 things that you should never do as killer in DBD. And again, this video took a ton of work, so I'd appreciate it if you dropped a like and subscribe down below.